Welcome to Back Away Slowly, where we walk through the mysterious places, explore ominous folktales, and seek out strange creatures to try to understand how they came to be, the effects they had on history, and still have on culture. All sources, social links, and more are available at backawayslowlypodcast.com. A warning that serious themes and language are used, so viewer discretion is advised. We wrapped up our own exploration into the Windigo in the last episode. However, as promised, we'll now get to hear from Professor Brady DeSanti, who was kind enough to indulge some of my questions. As a side note, I'll be including a list of names and terms in the episode description for reference. And now I'll let Mr. DeSanti introduce himself and share a bit about his own journey.
It's good to be here today. My name is Brady DeSanti. I'm a professor of religious studies at the University of Nebraska at Omaha, and I'm also the director of the Native American Studies program. My interest in Native American history and religious traditions is both personal and professional. From a personal standpoint, I was adopted at birth. I received some documentation that said that your birth mother was a Chippewa Indian and your birth father was from Havana, Cuba. I was raised with the perfect family, in my opinion. They have supported me every step of the way, and I would not be who I am without them. But as I got into college in my teen years, I started to become more interested in my biological parents and background, and I was interested in religious studies, obviously. And I thought, you have a Native background and maybe you could pursue that. So bit by bit in the late 90s, I started to try and make a connection. My mentor, who is Winnebago tribe of Nebraska, they call themselves the Ho-Chunk, Carolyn Fiscus, her nickname as a teacher of 50 plus years is Big Mama. And she started at in 1999. And I had a friend at the time who said, hey, we have this woman who's interested in Native kids that were adopted out and that maybe would like to reconnect. And I thought, I don't know about that. I was too busy kind of just being me, which as a college student, I was kind of a punk and just, working full time. But I met her and we hit it off. She dispelled some of the sort of stereotypes of, I says, I don't want to take away assistance for Native people who were raised within the culture, the lived experience. And she's like, no, you need to do this if you want to do it. And so I was able to get the information from the agency I was adopted from. When I made contact, it was the Oreilles Ojibwe tribe out of Hayward, Wisconsin. They have their own enrollment office. If you hear about somebody being enrolled, it's really tribal citizenship, and each tribe has their own criteria. There's blood quantum, there's lineal descent. And so I just was looking to see how this would go, and I made a connection. I called up there, and I forget the lady's name, but she was so kind to me. And when I gave her a name, she immediately said, I knew your grandma, Delia. She lived for years up here, and we haven't seen your mom in a while, but they gave me a family tree, and I was just blown away. I was overwhelmed. And it was in May of 2001. I got a phone call. I was living at home still, and my parents had an old answering machine. The enrollment office called and said, Brady, your mom was up here and we said you were kind of looking for her and she wants to meet you. And everything just sort of took off from there. In July of 2001, me and Big Mama, she went with me because her mom at the time had been separated from a brother of hers named Clifford, who lived up in Black River Falls, Wisconsin, which is part of the Winnebago's original homelands, the Ho-Chunk. She's like, how about we go and mom can meet her brother and then you can meet, as Carolyn put it, your people. When I met my birth mother, it was really, meaningful. And I met cousins and uncles, and I've made a few trips up there since then. And I had kept in contact with my birth siblings and with my birth mother, who she did pass away at the end of August, 2021. When I talk professionally, I always say I am an enrolled citizen of the Oreilles Ojibwe tribal nation. Our family on our side possesses Bad River Ojibwe ancestry. I've always told people, my students, and I'm telling you, that I do not have the lived experience of like an Ojibwe person. And so I don't speak on behalf of all Ojibwe people. And that's kind of my caveat, is that I was adopted out at birth. I reconnected later in life. And I've been very blessed and fortunate to not only learn more about Anishinaabe, Ojibwe traditions, but here in Nebraska, many people have been so kind to me to, I've learned the history of the plains, Lakota ways and Ponca and Omaha. And so when I talk about the Wendigo, and I think in my article, I do give that caveat, and it's to be respectful to Native people and to just be honest. I reconnected and it changed my life and it gave me my career. But I also think that I owe it to the truth of my heritage and my experiences to be honest to my audiences about that. And so I did a lot of research and talked to people about, the Windigo and stuff, but I in no way, shape, or form want your audience to think that I'm the be-all end-all on it, right? There's so many Native peoples that have a deeper lived experience and so forth out there. So yeah, it's very good to be here.
Thank you so much for sitting down with me. All right, let's start at the very beginning. As far as we know, how old is the belief in the Wendigo?
I know that there have been attempts to sort of date it to after colonialism, after contact with Europeans. But I think it's one of those things that goes back to, it's just been part of Algonquin-speaking people and Siouan-speaking people's traditions since time immemorial. And I've really looked at it more from a religious standpoint. But I think that there are some that you can look at it, historically as well.
In my own research, I've found records dating back to the 1600s, but that doesn't mean there aren't stories older than those written records.
The thing is that from oral traditions, which is how traditions are expressed, I think that it becomes very tricky because when it first, appears in the written word, doesn't necessarily, that's its first appearance within the life ways of the culture.
And that's what makes some of these topics so tricky. We can only account for the experiences that were written down, and that only goes back so far.
Right.
There's a theory that the Wendigo stories and belief may have evolved in response to the influx of settlers. With more people flooding the area, resources would have gotten tighter and tighter. Do you think this collision influenced Wendigo stories, or did those stories just rise in frequency in response to famine?
Yeah, no, I think you're absolutely right. I think that it definitely accelerated it, changed it in ways in response to maybe, and this is just me sort of speculating, but it may have taken on a greater manifestation in response to colonialism, the sort of loss of resources, the dispossession. And I think Windigo does become one of the possible meanings for it is it's a metaphor for colonialism. Just as the Windigo is insatiable for human flesh, so too was settler colonialism insatiable for land and resources from indigenous people. One of these ideas with indigenous cosmology is that it's a peopled cosmos. So you have human beings, and then you have other than human persons, which is really animals, plants, the natural forces and so forth are understood to be different types of people. And then you have spiritual beings. So it's a pretty crowded cosmos. And from a spiritual standpoint, there's the ability to metamorphose. And so it's very hard to just say the Windigo just means this. It has an adaptability within the cosmology. On the one hand, it can refer to he for himself in some traditions. I think it was Basil Johnson, an Ojibwe author who died several years ago, translated as he for himself, that the Windigo stands for gluttony and an overindulgence. But on the other hand, it can be metaphoric for, as we said, colonialism. It can stand for sort of the frozen areas of the far north and resource deprivation. I've heard some translations that it can mean owl, because the hoot of an owl can stand for death. And certainly to encounter a Windigo was to mean death. And if you look at the eyes of the owl, it's sort of this implacid, scary looking thing. And so too with Windigos. And of course, the owl is a flesh-eating bird. One of the other things that you find too is that Windigo can stand for being out of your wits. He included in that article an account of a Cree woman, which is they're very much related to Ojibwe people, Algonquin speaking. She went missing for a certain amount of time. And when she returned, there was a belief that having been isolated away from her community could have led to her becoming Windigo.
There are multiple ways to go Windigo, one of which is sorcery. One of the sources I read discussed that sorcerers can enforce isolation and therefore cultivate a Windigo scenario. Does isolation have to occur alongside other factors, or is isolation alone enough to create a Windigo?
From what I understand, I also think that it could also be, with creation stories, animals usually commonly are created first, and humans are amongst the last. So there's an understanding that animals and plants are our elder siblings, and that they give themselves to humans as sort of a gift, but humans have to reciprocate. But if humans overhunt a particular animal, each animal from an Ojibwe standpoint, species has an Ogima, sort of a spiritual caretaker. So that Ogima, if you're overhunting an animal for whatever reason, or you just anger it some way, that Ogima could withhold the game or create Windigo-like conditions.
Your paper was incredibly helpful to understand how the spiritual ecosystem works, particularly between animals and people. What I didn't know was that an insulted animal spirit could withhold game.
The Seneca, who are one of the 6 tribes that make up the Haudenosaunee, or the Iroquois Confederacy, and they're in sort of the upper part of New York, part of Canada, they had a tradition in which they described this kind of old man who became very industrious and became the progenitor of a great nation. And the way he built his home and territory, you learn from the description that it's the beaver. And he's sort of the equivalent of the Ogima of the beaver. And then another little person came along and said, hey, I kind of like the way you're living. Can I live by you? I'm not going to be as powerful or take anything over. This is muskrat. And so there's this harmonious relations amongst these two peoples. And then it said another new group of people, foreigners, came along and started indiscriminately murdering the beavers' wives, children, and so forth. As a result, these newcomers started to suffer diseases and plagues. So the old man beaver says, these newcomers just don't really get it. I'm going to talk to him. So he appears into the dream of one of the newcomers, the leader, and says, do you know why your people are starving and suffering these diseases? And the person says, no, I don't understand. He's like, because you're not being a good relative. You have overhunted us. You've killed my wives and children. If you would be a good relative and not do this, we would gladly give ourselves to you. And so we learn, this was the Seneca themselves that had to learn how to be good relatives, to live in balance with that. So there is a tradition in which, for instance, too, with vision quests, which are usually rites of passage, puberty ceremonies, and so forth. And there's variations on those. The ones I'm most familiar with here on the plains are called Humblecha from a Lakota standpoint. But for the Ojibwe in the Great Lakes area, it was usually tied sometimes to hunting society, that when a young boy was about to reach adulthood, they would go into an area that was known to have power and to give good visions, and they would fast for maybe 4 days without food or water. And they'd sort of open themselves up to the forces of the cosmos to find out what their life destiny may be. Sometimes an animal or something would approach you that would become sort of a protector for you. You wouldn't hunt it, and it would sort of look after you and would help sort of give you a roadmap for your life. Well, I found a tradition, I think it was a Cree one, in which a person had a dream vision and they were taken into a home, and it was filled with all sorts of meat, and he was very hungry and so forth. And as he got closer, though, he saw that it was human flesh. The understanding was, had he in his dream vision partaken of that human flesh, later in life, he would have been destined to become a Wendigo. And so what that tells me is that the ability of spirits within Indigenous cosmology, they can take on different shapes, they can have volition. And at some point, this person probably presumed I must have done something to offend one of the animal spirits. But I think it's really foundational to look at the Windigo not separate from the entirety of Ojibwe or Cree or even Dakota cosmology. And I just want to add, I'm not in any way, shape, or form really familiar with Dakota Windigo traditions, but they are there, and I want to acknowledge that. But with the creation stories, there used to be this assumption amongst anthropologists that Indigenous people somehow worshiped animals and so forth, and forces of nature. And as I said, it's really more about the idea that these are your relatives with whom you have kinship obligations towards. They fulfill their role and you fulfill your role. They play a part oftentimes in healing ceremonies, dream visions, They're even called Oyate from a Lakota standpoint, which means nation. They're understood to basically possess sort of a parallel social order to human beings, that human beings pattern themselves off of the animals. Because what's interesting in these creation stories is it's the animals and the plants that are actors and so forth. And humans are sort of the Johnny-come-latelys and learn from the actions of the animals and the sort of mythic time, a roadmap on how to live and treat one another. And I think that that's so foundational. It's not worship, it's being a good relative and reciprocating. Irving Hollowell was a famous anthropologist, and he coined the phrase other than human persons.
Most scholars don't accept Wendigo psychosis as a medical term anymore. Why is that?
Wendigo psychosis was tied to culture-bound syndromes, which no longer have relevancy from a medical standpoint. There was sort of an eruption of interest in the Wendigo by anthropologists in the 70s. It kind of went away until 2004. There was something in ethnohistory about werewolves and Wendigos. And then I came along a year later in 2005 and started kind of messing around with it. But it was tied to, was it due to a nutritional deficiency, seasonal changes in hunting? What would compel a native person from, these traditions to be consumed with this insatiable need to kill somebody and consume human flesh? And I think it was taking it a little too literal. And it also, I think, culture-bound syndromes pathologize certain segments of society and people that we associate that, this is associated just with that. I'll give you another example. I have suffered from sleep paralysis before. If you don't get into REM sleep, where you have your most vivid dreams, that's where your body secretes a chemical so that when you're dreaming, your body's paralyzed. You can't act out your dreams. And you don't want to think that you're flying and open the window and jump out. But what can happen if you're not getting into REM deep enough, you can become partially awake while you're still partially dreaming, but you can't move. The threat detection part of the brain starts to say, hey, what's going on? And so you start to visually see and hear scary things. There was a book called The Terror That Comes in the Night. He went to Newfoundland and he was looking at the Hag syndrome, where when you have sleep paralysis, you see sort of in their traditions, a scary witch type entity pressing on your chest because it's very hard to breathe during this episode. He had been experiencing that before. And so when he, who was outside of that tradition, started to say, hey, wait a minute, if I've had this experience and seen a scary entity, maybe it's not just in Newfoundland. And then they started to do studies in Japan with Kanashibari, the same thing. And so what started out as a culture-bound syndrome of the entity or the nightmare became universal, something that goes back to Babylonian times. And so I personally am not a fan of like culture-bound syndromes or the idea of Wendigo psychosis, because it sort of does something similar where it stigmatizes, in my opinion.
It definitely creates fear of a single group of people. If this cannibalism psychosis is labeled as only occurring to a specific group, then it becomes reasonable to fear that group. But that's not true. Cannibalism has occurred all over the world, and just because it's interpreted by a certain community to be incarnated as a creature, it doesn't mean that the community itself is the only group susceptible to it.
Cannibalism has been found in every culture throughout time, and it can have a ritual connotation. But then from an Ojibwe standpoint, I was always told and understood that cannibalism was seen as an ultimate sort of taboo. But what can happen with some cannibalism is what they call famine cannibalism, with serious resource deprivation, where you're just trapped in an avalanche or what have you. And so Windigo could stand for the absolute horror of having to do that under horrible circumstances.
I wonder if creatures like the Wendigo are a way to live with what you've had to do to survive. The beliefs surrounding a Wendigo give the perspective of, this sorcery happened to me. These circumstances happened to me. It also gives hope that you could be cured, which could give you a way to emotionally move on.
Possibly. I mean, the thing is that when a person is believed to be a Wendigo, there were attempts to restore them and cure them.
Luis Morano concluded in his paper that the Windigo condition was a way for a community to purge themselves of those who'd survived famine cannibalism before, or even to relieve themselves of those who would be a burden to care for, like the elderly, mentally disturbed, etc., labeling it the native version of a witch hunt. In my own research, I've found the majority of the group's cultural practices to be quite the opposite. What are your thoughts on this theory?
The witch angle, yeah, I disagree with that because it is true, unfortunately, that both in Europe, where there were tens of thousands of women and some men that were called warlocks, were put to death. And the documentation does show that there were instances where so-called social undesirables were accused of being witches so that they could be eliminated. And of course, if there was a trial, it was a mock trial because to prove that you weren't a witch still meant death, right? Healing from a native standpoint is always about restoration and restoring balance. So if you're sick, the idea is that your mind, body, and spirit are intimately tied together. Healers will acquire spirit guides when they're initiated to be healers, and they sort of diagnose a person's illness and tell the medicine person what to do. I've also found that Native people don't believe that we're helpless and that we have a power within ourselves to also heal. And so a good medicine person actually draws your own inner doctor out. That's oftentimes the gift of a medicine person, is to help the ill person see that they have gifts. And that gets us into a whole different realm. I think I'd mentioned to you once before that people that in our society with disabilities and so forth, which I don't think from a Western standpoint have been treated historically well, in an Indigenous way, they oftentimes, a person with those conditions are seen as potential medicine people. We call it the wounded healer, the person who basically has these sort of illnesses and so forth, but that's also a sign that they actually can help others. If a person was seen as a Wendigo, there were a lot of attempts to restore them back to balance and harmony. You wouldn't take the time to do that if you were just trying to get rid of social undesirables.
I didn't think of that, but it makes sense. There's been an unfortunate history of Native peoples being portrayed as savages, lacking compassion or empathy. This witch hunt theory just seems to perpetuate that prejudice.
You have these two very disparate stereotypes that Native peoples have been categorized into historically as either the ignoble, quote, savage. That means that all of them throughout North America were seen as devoid of reason, civilization, just barbarians. Then the opposite of that, which is equally untrue, is the noble, quote, savage, where this was a Garden of Eden and that Native peoples were just children of nature, peace, love, and harmony. Those stereotypes, what they do is they overlook the over 500 different tribal nations that do exist with different cultures and traditions. And then it also puts them into these categories. And Native peoples would say that that doesn't apply to either of us, these outsider stereotypes.
This whole concept reminds me of an episode of a podcast called Dead Meat, where they review horror movies. The episode in particular is episode 36, called Indian Burial Grounds, where they invited Cowlitz tribe member Joey Clift onto the show. They cover a lot of great stuff in that episode, but what our current conversation is reminding me of is what happens when the pendulum swings in the opposite direction. The hosts and guests talk about how the Indian burial grounds trope in films is actually also contributing to this practice of making Native peoples an other. They claim that Native burial grounds have the ability to curse those who come near them. Insisting on this implies that those Native peoples have an otherworldly power, making those people into something inhuman, something we can't relate to or understand.
It's a good point because in the late 1800s, there was this belief that Native Americans were going to go extinct. And so there was an attempt to either forcibly assimilate them with the boarding schools here and residential schools in Canada. So they sent out anthropologists to record what remained, but for scientific posterity's sake. Part of that meant digging up Native American remains and putting them in museums and laboratories. That was all part of scientific racism, where it was Samuel Morton before the Civil War believed he was someone that wanted to keep slavery. And so he encouraged, he's like, cranial capacity could determine intelligence. And so he would take Caucasian skulls and African skulls and see which one could hold the most sand. And of course, in his estimation, Caucasian skulls had a larger cranial capacity, were more intelligent. And so he thought that freeing enslaved people was an act of cruelty because they were so uncivilized, so that slavery was actually moral. But what you had by 1990 were like over 200,000 Native American remains in museums and so forth. So in 1990, the Native American Graves Protection Repatriation Act was passed, and it calls for all federally funded institutions to return those remains and ceremonial objects that were stolen too to tribes that can prove a historical or cultural connection to them. It's not a perfect law because states can get out of it sometimes. So Native peoples will take those remains and artifacts and their ceremony to rebury them. So yeah, that Hollywood trope of the Indian burial ground, it also, you know what it does? It ignores the living Native peoples that have ongoing histories to this day. And so these movies and horror novels and so forth that are written by non-Native peoples oftentimes use Indigenous people as sort of tropes, but they're also kind of giving the image that Native Americans are people of the past.
I think that by shoving Native culture into the past, it allows current people and governments to ignore their fight to be recognized. It makes it easier to dismiss their petitions to get their ancestors' remains and artifacts back. It ignores that these are a modern people who have advanced through time just like the rest of us.
One of my Lakota friends who does creative nonfiction, and she wrote a book called Bury My Heart at Chuck E. Cheese. It's kind of her memoir, which is a play on Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee. And she's hilarious. And she's like, I hate it when people say contemporary Native fiction or a contemporary Native person. She's like, oh, I just like swung in from the 19th century.
I've seen in countless visual depictions, read in a few Reddit stories, and even heard on other podcasts that the Wendigo has long ears or a crown of antlers, sometimes even a deer skull as a head. Out of over 18 sources, only one of them even mentioned it a single time. So how exactly did the whole antlered or deer-headed depiction come about?
Let's see how to approach this. I think I had mentioned to you that a lot of the Algonquin-speaking communities in the Ojibwe have the water monster. It basically is oftentimes depicted as a lynx or the serpent, and it stands for imbalance. And so you don't say its name outside of protocol because names have such a power in Indigenous communities. So to call the water monster by its name is to call it into your presence, which could mean death, and it could drown people, but just create illness. And so you would only say its name, and I won't say it because I want to respect cultural protocol, during the winter when the lakes are frozen over. The water monster is oftentimes associated with doing battle with the Anamiki, the thunder beings, who are the protector of Ojibwe people. There's an awesome book by Teresa Smith called Island of the Anishinaabe. And Anishinaabe is what the Ojibwe, Ottawa, and Potawatomi people call themselves, which means the people are human being. And all tribes have a name that they call themselves that means the people are human beings. The water monster always has horns. And so Jesuits and other missionaries and colonists thought that the water monster with the horns was sort of a variation on the Ojibwe version of Satan. All horns mean in Ojibwe traditions, from what I understand, is great power, perpetual power, that it's always got power. So it could be that that was conflated with the Windigo, and here I'm just speculating. But I agree with you that the movie Antlers, which I had my problems with, called Antlers, and it's always depicted as that. It could be to try and tie it to the forest in some way, like a stag or something like that. But there's never a reference in the oral narratives that I'm familiar with.
I assume it's a way to connect the monster with nature, or to make it more visually, quote, native. Or maybe it's just a way to push the creature for creative purposes. But that's tough because that might not be the right thing to do if you don't understand the creature or its context in the first place. In pop culture, most depictions of the Wendigo are of a mindless beast out for one thing: human flesh. However, in a lot of stories that I read, the Wendigo is a lot more strategic in plotting. This is a creature that can put on clothes and walk into town, a wolf among sheep. I wonder if this antler edition is a way to force the Wendigo into becoming a recognizable, visually obvious monster. Do you think that the more bestial Wendigo of Western pop culture is a way of simplifying a native creature?
It could be. There was a movie called Windigo. It actually showed pretty good the ability to metamorphose. And as the Windigo is a spirit, it could be an attempt to show that it can shapeshift, it can metamorphose, right, as a spirit. But in its sort of traditional form, from what I understand, and I always offer these caveats, it can exist in its giant form that you find that the sort of rail thin with a heart of ice would stalk the woodlands and off people like lone hunters and so forth. It can also exist in human form where the person appears to be human, but they just have these impulses to consume flesh. But I think the antlers and the horns is kind of a Western creation. I think spirits have intentionality and volition. So it definitely can have its own motives and so forth. So yeah, that kind of gets us into something that I think is important to the idea of good and evil. It's really more about balance and imbalance, kind of like in ancient Chinese traditions you find with Taoism, because in some Ojibwe traditions, they have special secret societies, medicine societies, that you're initiated. And in some traditions, you learn how to harness the power of the water monster to use for good. And so you can take something that has very negative connotations normally, but under very special conditions with a trained medicine person, they can use the power of the water monster to help. Years ago, when I was at the University of Kansas in graduate school, and I wrote my first iteration of an article on the Windigo, I got advice from an Ojibwe person, a lady from Canada that was taking classes at Haskell Indian Nations University, which is in Lawrence, Kansas. And she read my paper and she was very helpful. She just said that she was familiar with some traditions in which the Windigo was actually sort of employed by a trained medicine person to devour illness that could actually sort of be flipped temporarily. It gets us into this idea that good and evil in an Indigenous context, it's more about balance and imbalance.
I think it's that flexibility of what a Wendigo can be that tends to frustrate Western culture. People love for things to be set in stone, to know if a creature's good or bad.
Right. We like things fixed and just tell me what it means. Years ago, one of my colleagues was, she's an Indologist and does like Hinduism and Buddhism. And she was talking about Hinduism. And Hinduism really is like many different religions that has this sort of label, Hinduism. So she was talking to this, and this guy raised his hand and she's like, can't you just tell me what Hinduism is? Just definitively. And she's like, no. And so we do. Yeah, I think that we like certainty. And that's part of, I think, the human brain wants that.
I get not liking uncertainty. And sure, some of these topics are intimidatingly large. But I think it can be said that it's possibly irresponsible in these cultural cases to try to dilute them into something that's simple and easy. Why are Wendigo stories important now?
My personal opinion is Windigo is really about gluttony and selfishness. And in Indigenous communities, individualism, like we have in the West, like we prize the individual. But in a tribal setting, your identity is tied to the tribe. And so if you're shunned from the tribe, you no longer have a self, an identity. But also with resources and what have you, selfishness could lead to the ruination of your community and tribe. So I think that it's really a lesson about don't be selfish, because it will ruin you and it ruin your kin. So I think that's probably where it is. I do think the movie Ravenous did a good job of having the Windigo on one point, when they're talking about the Sierra Nevada, and they're like, manifest destiny. There's going to be all these people come the summer, and we'll just, it's a stand-in for colonialism, because Jack Forbes wrote a book in which he deployed the Windigo idea to look at colonialism from a global standpoint. And our whole society really is built upon resource extraction. And you look at the climate, you look at resource deprivation, more. It's a useful now metaphor, and sometimes more than a metaphor, because when you cut into the earth and you're kind of bleeding the earth dry, that's kind of this ravenous Windigo, the taking, and it's never enough. I know that in the rainforest, Indigenous people throughout the Amazon, they call their homelands like the lungs of Mother Earth, the lungs of the earth. And when you start to cut into that, you're really taking away, our ability to live. So I think the Windigo is important from that standpoint. For me, anyway, I think that it's useful to see now as the taking. It's never enough. Like the Windigo, the more flesh it consumed, its appetite kept pace with it. In some depictions, the Windigo in its giant form was it would chew its own lips off and they'd grow back.
I find it fascinating how the Wendigo is used so frequently in pop culture, but at the same time, it's incredibly underutilized. All of the attention is on the ultimate taboo, but with no focus on the horror of being truly alone and what it can do to a person, on what survival versus selfish consumption means for you as a person. What do you find is the most interesting element of the Wendigo creature, or what it can tell us?
I don't claim to be an expert on Ojibwe traditions and so forth, but in the article from 2015, The Cannibal Talking Head, I tried to say that to really understand the Wendigo, it has to be interpreted within the entirety of Ojibwe lifeways and cosmology. There's a concept in, like Lakota, they call it to walk the red road, that is to live a life of balance and to live in a good way. The Ojibwe call it Minabamadawazen, which means to live a good life. That means to treat other humans well, your plant and animal relatives and the spirits in a harmonious fashion. The Ojibwe believe that we also have two souls to go along with a physical body. Part of Minabamadawazen is to live in a balanced way. One of those souls, the ego soul, I've heard it called, is the part of you that's responsible for your knowledge, your reason, your rationality, your sense of self. It's housed in your chest region. And then you have the idea of the free-floating or dream soul. That's the part of you that's responsible for dreaming. It's the part of you that can leave your body and travel. It's responsible for creativity, spontaneity, following your gut instinct. Those had to be used at the right time in life. And so you'll find stories about the trickster, Nanabazu or Nanabush. In the long creation epic, he gets really upset and kills the water monster. And he has to go and learn from all of his other relatives and animals and spirit beings how to kill the water monster. And they say, don't do this, disaster will ensue, but he's a trickster and he's very angry. But along the way, the story here is showing Nanabazu in certain situations where he's using his ego soul, he's using his critical reasoning skill and so forth to solve a problem. Other times, though, he has to listen to his dreams or he has to follow his intuition. And so those stories are told to people in life to how to live in a good way at the proper time. Because the trickster, oftentimes stories are shown where he doesn't use his two souls, he uses them at the improper time. So one of my thoughts was when one or both of those souls is out of equilibrium, that could indicate Windigo behavior, that a person is possessed. So the idea that if a person's acting super selfish and conceited and so forth, that idea of the Windigo chewing its own lips off and the heart of ice, right? That selfishness could indicate that that person is very individualistic. In most traditions I'm aware of, the Windigo is solitary. You know, in a tribal community, you got to interact with the community and your relatives. Also, one take was that if the animals are your relatives and they give themselves to you, that's what you consume. But if a person's free-floating a dream soul, which is a part of you that is active during a vision quest that interacts with the spirit world, it could indicate that if a person's a Windigo, what do they eat? They don't eat the animals that are relatives that give themselves to you, they eat human flesh. And if that's the part of your soul that interacts with the spirit world and animals, it could indicate that your free-floating soul is out of balance. So I thought maybe tying the idea of Windigo into the concept of Minabamadawazen and the concept of balance and imbalance amongst your two souls and physical body. And it was kind of a hypothesis on my part, and I haven't gotten any pushback, but I thought that it was my way of interpreting the Windigo, one person's interpretation that tried to position the Windigo within the entire cosmology of the Ojibwe, as opposed to what pop culture does, which is kind of wretch it from its cultural moorings, and then it takes on all these weird connotations that we've talked about. And that idea of the Windigo as an indicator of imbalance, either personal and then by extension communal, the community out of balance as well.
We've discussed the concept that there are human spirits, animal spirits, and plant spirits. We also know that a person can become a Wendigo by being possessed by a Wendigo spirit. So would that Wendigo spirit on its own be a part of the spiritual ecosystem?
This is like I said, a peopled cosmos, and Another thing here is that Indigenous people, including the Ojibwe, believe that we live in a multi-leveled cosmos. The sky world has its own inhabitants. And then you have this world with humans and various spirits and plants and animals. And then you have a series of underworlds, which are associated not with hell or anything like that, but with their own beings and entities. And so what medicine people do when they enter an altered state, they go on soul flight, oftentimes to the sky world or to one of the lower worlds to find out what ails a person. So I find that medicine people, it's like a game of chutes and ladders. You know, they can go have to go to the sky world or different realms. And so what you find is that the Windigo is just one amongst these spiritual beings, amongst humans, plants, and animals that I call a peopled cosmos. So it's definitely its own individual entity. And I call it the entity.
I've also read about babies going Windigo. Animals can go Windigo. This made me think of diseases like rabies that might be able to explain it. With the spiritual belief that all spirits have their own intelligence, it seems to imply that not just any one, but anything can go Windigo. But have you heard of this?
I have not. Calvin Luther Martin wrote a book that was controversial in, I think, the 70s called Keepers of the Game. And he looked at some Great Lakes and other traditions in which the fur trade took such a toll on tribes because there became this sort of Native peoples weren't to overhunt and so forth, but the pressures put on them by the French and English for beaver pelts became so much that overhunting in some cases took place. And with the introduction of smallpox and horrible diseases, Martin believed that some of the Indigenous people felt that the Beaver Nation and others were declaring war on them for overhunting them. So there was a belief that our animal kin have declared war upon us because of what we've done and we're suffering all these diseases. I really can't comment on the veracity of it other than the fact that it does do justice to the idea that Native peoples do see animals as different types of people with volition.
In 1999's Ravenous and the second episode of Supernatural in 2005, the Wendigo is shown to have the ability to throw and mimic voices. I haven't come across this in my research, but have you?
I mean, I would say that it's possible because, again, spirits can do that. It reminds me of the little people, which all tribes have a variation on for the most part. And these are very powerful spirit beings. And you can find the fairy folk, pre-Christian, written in Ireland, and those were usually associated with the dead. They weren't always these friendly little people, and people were afraid of them. And Indigenous people, I found accounts where the little people sometimes could save a person and bestow the power to have healing and save their life. There's a chapter in a book I co-edited, Understanding and Teaching Native American History, and it's written by Dr. Don Fixico, who is Muskogee, Seminole, and Shawnee, and I think Choctaw. He was my first advisor. So his chapter talked about this kind of a tragic incident where a young person was tricked during a blizzard by different voices coming from different directions. So they finally got lost and they walked in a full circle and died. And it kind of showed that they'd completed the circle of life, but the little people in this case were sort of ambivalent, like what were they trying to accomplish? Was it time for that person to die? There is trickery of the little people throwing their voices and creating mischief and so forth.
In pop culture references, the Wendigo can be hundreds of years old. But once again, I haven't found that in classical interpretations.
I mean, I can't date the Windigo, and I think that you can find the historical references in Smallman's book, Dangerous Spirits. But I think from a spiritual standpoint, since it's tied into this cosmological viewpoint, that could go back thousands of years. I mean, the Ojibwe have migration narratives along the Atlantic coast as well. I would feel safe saying it goes back thousands of years in some capacity, and it can change and be used in different ways, understood in different ways. There's an article by Ray Fogelson that called the Windigo Go South, where he tries to look at possibly Windigo traditions having possibly made it to, I think, Iroquois and Cherokee territory, but they take on different connotations with different names. So I think that the concept of cannibals and giants are shared amongst Native North America, but I think they're all culturally specific too. Albert Kroger, or he's an anthropologist working with a Washoe, California tribe. A woman at some point during the time of assimilation, and it was a terrible time, particularly California tribes were hit so hard by colonialism and the gold rush. And he wanted to hear a story about their version of these cannibals. he thought she was going to talk about the ancient past and mythology. And she said, back in those days, we found that they were men, though. And she took his hand and said, they were men like you. And so she was using her version of these giant entities that took things as an illustration to say, you're part of this process. You're doing what they do.
You're a lot closer to the monster than you think you are.
Right.
You mentioned on a previous call the importance of appropriate storytelling. Do you want to get into that a little?
Not everybody has the authority in Native societies to tell certain stories. If you're trained in oral traditions to tell the stories, you learn the etiquette, the protocol, when to tell the stories. You become a caretaker. Because when you tell that story becomes a living entity itself. It's alive with power. And a story is not just a story. That story can change things. And so it's seen as alive with power.
Speaking of the importance of appropriate storytelling, I wanted to cover skinwalkers this season, but decided not to as I wouldn't be able to adequately research it in time. I also wouldn't want to cover it without interviewing someone from within the community, if possible. You shared with me that decades ago, anthropologists started recording Navajo healing songs. What they didn't realize was that once it was known that a song had been recorded, the Navajo stopped using it, as recording the song had taken its power, removing their ability to use that specific song to heal anyone, ever again.
Given the fact that I'm not Dene, which is Navajo, I want to be very careful with this, but I do know that a lot of the concept of Hojo is balance, right? Hikali is a singer. And a lot of times for their ceremonies, from what I understand, a person might be for 4 nights put in a hogan, a little home, and that there's certain songs that will be sung that are for that person that have a certain purpose to heal a person. But you can't just use that song out of its proper ritual context. Not just with the Dene, but other tribes have variations on this. So when anthropologists started to record Native traditions and so forth, a lot of times if you find out later that a song or a story that was used for healing was used for a different purpose, in this case, let's say a music of the people class or something like that at a university, then that song would lose its power, its medicine power. And I think that that's why a lot of Native peoples aren't trying to be rude to say, I don't want to talk about this, just to not talk about it.
I think it's important to preserve culture, but it's imperative that we do so within the boundaries of that culture. When it comes to what I do, I want to do these topics as appropriately as I can. As interesting as many subjects are, I don't want to cover a topic that I have no place in discussing, where it's inappropriate to put it out into the world via my platform. How do you suggest that I or other creatives go about even figuring that out? How do creatives, people in general, and even pop culture at large do better?
Yeah, I think that approaching people in a good way, and I think you've done an excellent job of that. Getting to the idea of movies and pop culture representations, Native peoples really want depictions of the here and now, the current issues. If you look at the sort of renaissance of Native films in the last few years and streaming series that have creative Native people in control of the creative process, you aren't looking at Westerns. You aren't looking at things from 100 years ago, 200 years. You're always looking at the here and now. I think Reservation Dogs is definitely worth checking out. Rutherford Falls was awesome. It lasted for 2 seasons on Peacock. So I think things like Skinwalkers and Wendigos, they have basically been taken, I think, from an appropriation standpoint by pop culture with non-Native creatives. And I think that sort of is part of, I'll just say this. A lot of Native people have told me that they're tired of Windigo movies, so it's played out, right? But you see this fascination on Reddit and others in which something that happens in, I don't know, Utah is someone says, I wonder if that's a Wendigo. Like the movie Antlers, which I had a problem with, which the Wendigo has never been in Oregon and so forth. And it's under non-Native control. And like Graham Greene, who's Oneida and a beloved Native actor, and he's in it for like 2 minutes, and he's just there to offer a little bit of supposed Native wisdom. When Native people are the directors and script writers and the actors, in my experience, you aren't seeing them do things about the Windigo or Skinwalker. Like they're more concerned about other things going on in tribal communities today. And I'm not saying that these aren't still things, but really quick, I will say that the movie, the TV series on AMC, Dark Winds, they made a point, because it's the Dene, even though the actors are different tribes, to not use skinwalkers, because that's a very taboo thing to talk about in Navajo ways. They do talk about witchcraft, which people can find controversial, but they specifically, Navajo consultants, from what I understand, said they didn't want any references to skinwalker.
There are some creatures, like the skinwalker, where a large part of their folklore is that you don't say its name, or even talk about it at all for fear of attracting its attention. Does this mean that to discuss the subject in any way would be offensive in and of itself? Is it a case of don't touch it, it's not yours to talk about?
I think that these pop culture representations are interesting, and it's just that Native creatives just really don't touch upon them, because I think there's so much going on in contemporary, here I'm using contemporary, but in the here and now. You know, voodoo, which is a terribly misunderstood religious traditions. In the West, all the movies have reduced it to zombies and voodoo dolls, which aren't even historically accurate. And so I think there's a bit of that with Native Americans. It's kind of like, you know, that these are almost emblematic of sort of freezing us in time as the sort of eternal primitive in Hollywood. And I think what's overlooked in these so-called horror movies and so forth, they overlook Native humor. If you watch all of these new shows, even with horribly sad stuff, there is just this mixture of grief and sadness with gut-wrenching humor. And I think that most non-Native Americans don't understand just how much humor has played a role in Native life. As my mentor said, and I consider the matriarch of our program, said that we're still here. That's always her thing.
I know we've talked about one monster that lives within the beliefs of a handful of tribes, within hundreds of tribes, but I'm glad that it lets us talk about these topics. My show is admittedly entertainment, but I think it's important to look at the past and present impact of each topic, and I rarely come across a subject or creature that is so popular, yet so wildly unknown at the same time. The internet is obsessed with the Wendigo, and yet somehow, the more people know of it, the less people seem to actually know what it is, where it's from, or why it's important.
Well, it could just be this idea that Western pop culture has played out vampires and werewolves to an extent, and they're just mining non-Western traditions for what they can use, but they're constantly taking aspects of living traditions and so forth and using them. They just become a new monster of the week. It's almost a form of colonizing.
But I don't understand how it's been popular for years, and yet so little of the Wendigo's history and lore has been explored. I don't know if it's just intimidating to look into such an old history, or if people are unwilling to look for and read academic papers.
It kind of hits home is that the Journal of Religion and Popular Culture, which the 2015 article was published, they're an awesome journal, but it's behind a paywall. I wrote another one, Classroom Cannibal, more of a pedagogical teaching device. That's in the online Journal of Religion and Film, which is through my Department of Religious Studies. So that's open. So when I get inquiries about the Wendigo, it's always that paper, not the one that I'm most proud of, which is behind the paywall.
I've interviewed folklorists, ghost hunters, professors, parapsychologists, and almost all of them have mentioned a huge frustration with putting in months or years of research only to have their paper put behind a paywall. It makes research in academia inaccessible.
When I get inquiries like with you, and I've got many others, I always make sure I send that paper. So I've gotten in the habit of, I have these on PDF and I send them to people so they don't have to pay for them.
Pop culture has made it hard to reach out to these communities and be taken seriously. You know you sound like just another podcaster or creator trying to mine information on a sensational topic and then move on.
Or sometimes a person does it and they'll get pushed back from their community and so forth. I always tell people that I'm not just an island. And so what I say in classrooms and here and now, I'm responsible to communities, a large community. And if I say something wrong, which I will hear about it quite stridently. And so that it can be kind of intimidating.
When asked if current tribes believe in the Wendigo, I received opposite sides of the coin. One side says that some communities actively believe in the Wendigo, while the other side says that's a creature from the old days. What have you heard?
It really depends. I don't think it's gone away. I don't know how prevalent it's referenced, but I would suspect that those who say it's just part of the old days, it has no relevance, might be trying to distance from the stereotype of the eternal primitive and that's associated with. So yeah, I know that this is not a helpful answer, but I think it's just dependent upon the particular community. I mean, the Ojibwe are a huge tribe, and you have Minnesota, Wisconsin, Michigan, you have in Canada too. So they're the largest tribe with residencies both in the United States and Canada. So you could find a community within Canada somewhere in which these sorts of ideas look and play out differently than an Ojibwe community in Wisconsin. So I think it's just so contextual and contingent. I would say that it is still an ongoing aspect that you still find in Algonquin-speaking traditions. I don't think that it's referenced to a whole lot, but I would feel uncomfortable saying it's just completely, as a concept, gone.
Times have changed. It's no longer the 16 and 1700s. We're not in the middle of the fur trade anymore. But that doesn't mean that Wendigo circumstances can't occur or that traditions are no longer practiced.
I mean, for instance, tobacco as an offering there's variations on this story, but one that I've heard on the plains, and I hate to be general, but that at some point the Earth Mother, out of one of her breasts, created maize, and out of the other, tobacco. The spirits were around and loved tobacco. It's so sweet. And so she withheld tobacco from them. She's like, I'm going to give this to humans because you guys love it so much that when they are in need, they'll offer that tobacco to you and you'll have to help them. That has, over time, become an etiquette of when you need help from an elder or a medicine person, you bring them tobacco. Oftentimes, like when the Ojibwe harvest wild rice on the lakes, I know that Ojibwe people still will give tobacco offerings to sort of make sure the water entities are appeased in a good way. So that still takes place. And so there's still these cultural mannerisms that take place with like tobacco offerings, but it's not necessarily, I'm doing this specifically for this reason from 100 years ago. It's more of a cultural etiquette type thing. It's kind of like eagle feathers at graduation for high school and college students. I've heard traditions that the eagle was the one that could give an offering to the sun on behalf of all the different people. And so it was blessed for having done that. So there's kind of a religious connotation and different traditions on that. When a student asks to wear eagle feathers, they're not thinking of these sacred stories. Eagle feathers now, when you're given one, it means you brought great honor to yourself and family. They're doing it more of like, hey, I was given this feather. This is a cultural thing that means I brought great honor to myself and people. So there's that connection. But in the mind of an administrator who's like, well, we don't want anything religious on display at high school graduation, so forth, they're missing the point that these things have been nuanced. It's a cultural sort of thing. Native religions were outlawed from about 1887 to about 1934, 1940. You've got the American Indian Religious Freedom Act of 1978. So there's still a struggle for full religious freedom for Native peoples. I think that's also something that is important for kind of the non-Native world to know, is that oppression was so horrendous. The 60s, with the Red Power movement, the Civil Rights movement, the Red American Indian movement, the Red Power, where you started to see young people start to reclaim the language that was outlawed, the religious practices, and just being Native, because assimilation was pretty horrifying. And I think so much of like, it's a good example, like Native religious traditions might be done outside at a sacred site, at a mountain or what have you, or a body of water. And that place is important, but what if it's in a national park? And then you have to get permission from the park to do a religious ceremony, and then it goes to the Supreme Court or whatever. And I think in the minds of a lot of judges is that they think of religion, they're supposed to be unbiased, but the religion that's most prevalent is Christianity. And so religion in the minds of many people is something you do in a building, whether it be a mosque, synagogue, or church. What you do outside, the category in a lot of people's minds is that's recreation. And so that also is contested too, is that how we think of religion is pretty rigid.
A good chunk of my Mammoth Cave episodes talks about the discovery and treatment of artifacts and mummies that were found. The native mummies in particular were put on display for a long time, or were outright destroyed. Fortunately, if you look at the Mammoth Cave National Park site now, they state that they reach out to relevant tribes if there's a discovery of any new artifacts or bodies.
I will say the national parks have become, by and large, very good allies of Native people.
To people who listen to those Reddit stories where the comments are flooded with the suggestions of Wendigos and Skinwalkers, and to those interested in understanding these creatures further or in Native culture in general, what would you want them to know?
Honestly, I would say off the top here is that Indigenous people, Native Americans, are still here with ongoing dynamic histories. Despite the assimilation, the colonization, the real horror show was colonization. That Indigenous people are still here with a resiliency and an adaptability and a relevancy. And that I think just be careful that when you read about ancient, quote, Indian folklore and this and that, kind of interrogate where did this source come from? It might have been from an anthropologist in the late 19th century who really didn't have the best motives. Was this taken basically under duress from a Native community? Does it accurately represent the living tradition? Think of tribal nations. There's, I think, 564 federally recognized tribal nations in the United States. Reservations are the remnants of those homelands that were reduced by treaties. But tribes have their own constitutions, their own police force, their own citizenship criteria. We were made citizens in 1924. I think just be aware that there's entertainment. I'm, not saying don't read Reddit stories because I read Reddit too. But I think just an awareness of Native Americans are still here, ongoing histories, and that they're involved in all sectors of life. Yeah, attorneys, doctors, college professors, biologists. So I think that as long as a person starts to broaden their conception of Native peoples aren't just people of the past, I think that's probably the biggest admonishment I would encourage people to see.
A question did just occur to me, and I'm curious about your thoughts. Why is it okay to use vampires and werewolves as creative fodder in pop culture? I mean, zombies are frequently claimed to have originated in Haiti, from another group of people who have a horrifying history, but now it's incredibly common to see zombies in pop culture.
Right. I mean, in voodoo, I'm not obviously an expert, but it comes from West Africa, very diverse. And then with the slave trade, it's sort of in the Caribbean and parts of the southeastern United States becomes sort of syncretically blended with Catholicism, where some of the spirit beings in voodoo and so forth become also associated with Catholic saints. And a lot of the ideas behind the voodoo doll and all of that, those, again, a good case could be made that Hollywood basically did what it's done with the Windigo, because voodoo is a very complex religion. But when you see accounts of voodoo, it's always sort of this stereotypical, what is most garish and the other, like you've said.
And I'm sure that there are some people who hear this conversation and think, do we have to be offended by everything? But I want to make it clear that that's not really what we're saying. I think it's important to acknowledge the origins of what we consume, and that there may be much more to our monsters and stories than we're aware of. But yeah, what's the difference between a creature like a zombie and a Wendigo? Is it simply the passage of time in the spotlight of pop culture?
I think that it's through cultural diffusion and the passage of time that vampires and so forth aren't as closely associated with a living dynamic culture, tradition, or people. I could get pushback because there is a religious tradition in Washington called the Temple of the Vampire, in which there's consensual blood drinking. And so maybe people could get mad at me saying that's not part of the living traditions. And, it's considered a federally protected religion. I think also that for Native peoples, that so much has been taken that it's another form of extractivism.
So these Native tribes have had their lands, freedom, and even children taken from them. And this is just another thing that's been taken.
And there's no reciprocity in it. I haven't entirely figured it out in terms of why vampires and werewolves are palatable and have been for so long. Aspects of those, beliefs like the Windigo and so forth, in my opinion, can't be taken out of their cultural moorings and done justice to.
Yeah, I guess you could put a vampire or werewolf just about anywhere, but their folklore is present in one form or another in just about every corner of the world.
Right, and while the Windigo isn't the centerpiece of Anishinaabe traditions, there's a component of interpreting it alongside all of what we've talked about that I think Native peoples get kind of understandably upset about. It's like, hey, you don't really understand that unless you understand the entirety of our culture. And that also comes from traditionally indigenous religions, if you will, didn't separate the sacred and profane. And profane is just ordinary and everyday life stuff. I mean, Columbus at one point in one of his journals noticed the indigenous people of the Caribbean and said they appear to be a peaceful people and they should be made Christian rather easily because they don't appear to have a religion. It is true that there is no word for religion in Native American traditions. That doesn't mean it's not there. But the sacred and profane are so fused together that it's impossible from a Western standpoint to pick out what is and what isn't. You know, pottery making and basket making and weaving for like the Pomo in California is an act of spirituality. And most people in the West would think, you know, that's a nice arts and crafts. But the understanding would be you're pouring your spirit into it. And when you give life to something, it takes on life. So I think there's some of that, is that the Wendigo isn't like the most sacred or centerpiece, but it has to be understood within the entirety of Ojibwe cosmology, I think. And when it's taken out of that cultural context, it no longer has these different meanings.
Well, I could go on forever about these things, but I know you have some other things to get to.
I'm happy to follow up if your viewers have questions.
If I get any questions sent in, we can definitely arrange for another interview. And so ended my interview with Professor DeSanti. And so ends our Windigo chapter. Hopefully you learned a lot of new information. And as Professor DeSanti said, if anyone has questions they'd like me to cover with him, you can send them in at backawayslowlypodcast@gmail.com. I hope you've liked this deep dive, because our next creature is also fairly well known, but its history of sightings was what drove me to cover it. There are so many different versions of its origin story, and despite how many times it's been seen, people can't even agree on what exactly it looks like. So I'll hopefully see you same time, same place, next week.